In this module, we're going to cover the different tactics for designing responsively in Figma, and also talk about how to work with developers to ensure that your products look great on every device. Now, in order to lay the foundation for responsive design, we're going to start today by covering some of the different strategies for designing at breakpoints. Let's dive in. So what are breakpoints? Well, they're preset device widths that trigger changes in our designs. And it's not entirely up to us. These are actually going to be defined in the code base. And so one of the most important things when thinking about responsive design is talking to your developers to ensure that you're designing at the right device sizes and aligning on what these key breakpoints are. I've outlined some of the more traditional ones, and these are actually taken from Tailwind CSS, which I refer to a lot when it comes to responsive design. But basically, when you're actually creating your UI, you should always be using one of these breakpoints and getting in the habit of communicating to developers which breakpoint a certain design is relating to. Now, there are two main things that can change at a given breakpoint. One is the actual layout of our page UI, which could look something like this. A lot of times these layout changes are flipping to a single column in order to work well on more narrow device sizes. Now, the other kind of change is a component change. And if we zoom in here, what often happens is you'll have some kind of a predefined component, probably using auto layout, and you'll have a padding, and maybe the elements inside of it will have some kind of a height. Now, let's say that we switch to a mobile breakpoint or even a tablet breakpoint. That might mean that this component then has a smaller width, and then you can see the actual height of this element has changed as well. So it's the same component. We're just updating how that component is displayed at a different breakpoint. And I have a note here that a lot of times when we're switching to one of our tablet sizes or a mobile size, the biggest thing that we're going to be updating is actually switching to a different set of text styles that relate to that breakpoint. Now, I talked about this in the typography lesson, but at the very least, I'll have a set of text styles for desktop and one for mobile. And so at my smallest breakpoint, I'll update my text styles, which is represented by this smaller rectangle here. One of the best mental models for thinking responsively is seeing things in sets of columns and rows, because really all of our UI is wrapped into these larger containers or divs as they're called in code. And if we're using auto layout, it's going to force us to build things in the same way that our developers are. And that's going to help us create these content groups where we'll have some row of content, and maybe at a 1024 or 768 breakpoint, we'll have that flip to a single column so that we can have a more narrow screen. And then on mobile, all we're doing is taking this row here where we have the pink and the green and making that a single column. And so this pattern right here is the vast majority of responsive design, honestly. It's as simple as that. It's taking things that were in rows and flipping them to a column to accommodate a more narrow device. So if you have this mental model in your head, it's going to make things a lot easier to strategize how a design is going to evolve as devices shrink. And that brings me to my next point. When we're thinking about responsive design, this is when your layer list in Figma becomes more important than ever. Because what you're doing when you're creating your layer list is actually creating a blueprint of what the HTML structure is for your developers. And I know you heard me say HTML and part of your stomach sank thinking that you had to know how to code or something like that. And it's not true. You don't have to know any of the syntax whatsoever, but there are some high level mental models and strategies that are used in HTML that we can emulate in Figma, and it's going to make this process of collaborating with your developers way easier. And the starting point is I highly, highly encourage you to be using auto layout for all of your designs. In fact, I would go so far to say as 95+% of every component and every piece of UI that I create is built entirely using auto layout. And what that does is it forces you to group content in the same way that developers are going to build out divs, or really just boxes, in HTML. And the goal with this grouping of content is that as our designs evolve, so as we're moving to smaller and smaller breakpoints, or larger and larger, depending on which direction you're headed, we want to be able to keep this layer list the same. So all of our updates are going to be happening by switching between rows and columns and vice versa. And if we can do that, it's going to make your engineers' lives way easier, because that's how they're going to build things in code. They're not going to rewrite this layer list at different breakpoints. This layer list is going to stay the same, and we're going to be updating the styles at each breakpoint. So as a high-level best practice for responsive design, build things in auto layout and keep the order of your layer list the same, and it's going to be a breeze for your engineers to build. Now, another best practice for responsive design is actually starting off with your mobile designs and then scaling up from there. And the simplest reason is that it's a lot easier to add things to your UI than to take things away. And so we want to start off with the absolute simplest, most constrained view of our UI, like this authentication layout here. And then at bigger breakpoints, we can add to it in order to create something like this larger modal here, where I'm going to surface this left panel. And all that's happening between breakpoints is I'm just showing and hiding this whole section of content over here. And that works great because we want to keep the HTML, or our layer list structure and order, consistent. And when you show and hide things, that doesn't change the order at all. And that's how developers are actually going to build it in code. They're just going to set it to display none. So a lot of times we're just going to have less stuff on mobile, and that's totally okay. We want to stay focused on mobile and then add additional elements to our UI at larger devices. Now, another reason that it's really beneficial to start off with mobile is that most content on mobile is always going to be set to 100% width, or in auto layout terms, fill container. And so what we're saying here is that this chunk of content isn't actually 343 pixels. We're saying that instead, the space around this content should always be 16 pixels, and then the content itself should expand to fill the container regardless of which mobile device we're actually viewing it on. So then at larger breakpoints, one of the most important pieces of collaborating with developers is going to be communicating what the max width of a given piece of UI is. Because if this piece of content can expand indefinitely, what's the stopping point? How big can it actually become? And when developers are looking at our UI, that's one of the questions that they're going to be asking themselves is this modal right here a set pixels? Is it actually 960 pixels every time? Or is this still 100% width, but with a max width of 960 pixels? And the difference is when a modal is at something smaller than 960 pixels, it's not going off of the edge of the screen. It's actually shrinking to accommodate that smaller device size. But on really, really big monitor screens, we don't want this modal to stretch 1800 pixels or something like that. And so we want to communicate to developers that, hey, this modal is 100% width in that it is responding to the width of the screen, but it never gets bigger than 960 pixels. And I actually added a little example file to give you just a little snippet of how I would communicate breakpoint logic and max widths to developers as a part of the handoff process. So if we look at this really quickly, I have each breakpoint defined up here. Then I have a little note that is just from my handoff helpers library that I use to communicate the different logic at these breakpoints. And so you can see one of the main things I'm saying is that the max width of this modal is 960 pixels. As a result, I don't actually have to design the 2XL breakpoint because nothing changes. The modal stays at 960 pixels. Now, if we move down here, you can see, look, the coarse panel padding decreases to 24 pixels. Remember, at breakpoints, two things can happen. The layout can change or the individual component can change. And so this is an example of a component updating. We're decreasing the padding so that I can fit more content more easily in less space. Moving down here, you can see the max width on the modal has actually changed to 560 pixels. And that's because we've wrapped this to a column. And this brings up another point. You can see here that I actually have different sizes within each breakpoint. I have an 800 pixels here and a 1024 pixels here. And the reason for that is I want to communicate how a design responds within a given breakpoint. And that's just a high-level best practice as well. We want to design around the worst-case scenarios. In this situation, the worst-case scenario for the large breakpoint is getting down to about 800 pixels. That's when things can get the most squished before it flips to this column here. So I want to show developers, hey, how ugly can this possibly get? Because if I don't think through the smallest possible screen size within a given breakpoint, what can happen is that my designs will look really good at the highest end of the breakpoint, but as it gets smaller, it'll get super squished and actually break. So I do that pretty much everywhere. I'll get all the way down to 480 pixels and then 768 pixels here. And so right here, you can see we're saying, hey, this is 100% width, but there's 16 pixels padding for the actual screen itself. But I don't want this to be as big as 16 pixels padding over here. That would start to look pretty ridiculous if we pulled this all the way across. And so instead I'm saying at this breakpoint, there's a max width of 560 pixels so that this is the biggest the modal can get, and then this is the smallest the modal can get. And then the last thing here is on mobile, you can see we've actually removed that panel altogether. There's a slight update to the HTML because I have a specific modal defined for mobile breakpoints that we're going to be using. And that's a good thing to bring up. Like I said, the goal is to keep your layer list the same, but don't prioritize that over a design that actually works really, really well on mobile. And so in this case, I am making a subtle update. I've changed this header to contain the title and the X, where before I actually just had a floating close button outside of the modal itself. And the only other thing I'll call out is this info card right here. This is the exact same card as this piece of UI over here. It's the same thing, the same layout. The layer list is the same. The HTML structure is the same. All I've done is swap out my text styles to mobile text. I've decreased the margin so that things are a little bit tighter because I don't have as much room to work with on mobile. And then I've changed the style. It's now white. And that's totally okay. Those kinds of cosmetic changes at different breakpoints are not a big deal whatsoever. If I would have totally broken apart this card and designed it a different way and things were in different orders and my layer list had changed, that would be much more difficult to do on mobile than to just update some of the colors and spacing. And that's pretty much it. When you're done, you're gonna have something that looks like this. You're gonna have your different breakpoints defined. You'll have different component styles for your different breakpoints. And we have a whole lesson that goes into how we can use variants to accomplish that. And then you'll have thought through what are the worst case scenarios? How scrunched can this possibly get within a given breakpoint? And you'll have communicated the different max widths to your developers so that they know exactly how to bring your UI to life.